Alright, now the last piece of the puzzle for the tile material is some wavy imperfections for all the tile surfaces, which I mentioned earlier in the project. Because this will be a more subtle detail and won't really benefit a whole lot from true displacement, we're actually going to be creating a bump map for this, which we'll be plugging into the normal input of the principled node. So we won't be adding this to the displacement map for true displacement, and we'll instead just be creating a bump map to affect the surface normals. And that's the workflow we'll be following for the rest of the project too. We'll be putting the big details in the true displacement map, and we'll be putting the finer details into a bump map which will only affect the normals. This is mainly just a preference too. We could put every detail into the displacement map and it would work just fine, especially since we have the material's displacement option set to display both displacement and bump. That's the best of both worlds and make sure the bump details are still there even if there's not enough geometry to physically displace them. So that's what I mean by saying this is more about preference, and for several reasons. One big reason is that by putting these details into a bump map, we don't have to be as careful about displacement strength values. We can mix details together in a more carefree way without worrying as much about one thing physically displacing way more or way less than it should. Like when we were combining the displacement map details, we were very careful about the strength values we plugged into the displacement node, because they all had to be exactly right in order to look right in the end. We don't have to be nearly as careful about bump map details. It's much more forgiving, so it allows us to have a more casual workflow. So now let's get started by creating a height map. And once we're finished creating the height map, we'll plug that into a bump node, which will convert that into a normal map for us. So let's go back up to our tile material nodes up here again. And for the wavy surface, we'll use a noise texture. So let's press Shift and A, and from the texture menu, add in a noise texture. And I'll drop it there below the mix node. And this will need some texture coordinates, so let's grab the main texture coordinates coming up from the add node right here. And it's already going up to the other texture nodes up there. So let's just add a reroute through that line and then stretch it on over. So let me hold Shift and right click and drag through there for a reroute, and then I'll click on that and drag it over to that vector input. And let's hold Control, Shift, and left click on this to preview it. Now if we zoom in a little bit, this texture is looking a little bit too noisy, and this will produce a more noisy surface when I just want a little bit of waviness. So let's turn the detail value down to 0. And there we go. This should produce a nice smooth waviness for the surface now. And let's also turn the scale value down to 3 as well to make the texture a little bit larger so things aren't too wavy. And now we just need to plug this in as the height map for the bump node. But I want to make sure that it's only affecting the tiles and not the grout. So we'll need a mask showing us exactly where the tiles are. And then we'll only have the waviness appear in those areas. So let's find the mask that we used to define the tile and grout colors over here. So this node here defined the tile and grout color, and this node here I believe is the mask. Let me preview that. And it is. So this mask here shows us where the tiles are and where the grout is. But the problem is when I zoom in, you can see we still have those gradients around the cracks that we used for a little color bleeding from the grout. But for this bump map, I just want a perfect black and white mask to know exactly where the tiles are. So let's run this through a math node set to greater than. And for that, I actually have a greater than node right over here already. So let me select that, and I'll press Shift and D to duplicate it, and just move it down here somewhere. And our mask is right here, so let's connect this color output to the value input of the greater than node, and then I'll hold Control and Shift and left click on it to preview. And there we go, no more gradients. And that's because the threshold for this node is already at 0, so all values above 0 will become perfect white, and this gets rid of those gradients and leaves us with just perfectly sharp borders around all the cracks and missing tile areas. So now we can use this as a mask to get the waviness in just the white areas. And we'll do that by using a mix RGB node with this mask. So let's add one in, but actually before we do that, let's move this greater than node down here. We're going to work in this empty area. So I'll click on that and drag it down to right there. And now let's press Shift and A for the add menu, and from the color menu, let's add in a mix RGB node, and we'll drop it over that line so it connects. Now it automatically connected the greater than node into the color 1 input, but we want to use this as the mix factor, so let's click on color 1 and drag that up to the factor input. And let me change color 2 real quick just to make sure this is working, and it is, perfect. So the mask is showing color 1 for the grout areas and color 2 for the tile areas. So the plan now is to plug the noise texture into color 2 so it only shows on the tiles. And for color 1, we'll keep this set to a neutral gray value of 0.5. Just like with displacement maps, a value of 0.5 won't produce a bump in either direction. Those areas will stay still. And now for color 2, we'll plug in the noise texture. So left click on this mix node to make sure it's selected. And let's go back over to the noise texture. And then hold shift and select that. And then press the F key to create a connection between them. And now we have a connection, but it's obviously not quite right. First, it's showing us the noise texture in the grout areas. And second, it's showing us the color output instead of the factor output, which is black and white. And that's the one we need for a height map. So to get the factor output connected to this line, let's simply hold shift and right click and drag through it to add a reroute, and then click on the factor output and drag it to that reroute, and that will cut the other connection, and now it connects the black and white noise texture to the mix node. And now if you want to, you can select this reroute and press Ctrl and X, which will delete that but maintain that connection. Alright, and now let's go back down to the mix node and we'll swap this connection by clicking on color 1 and dragging it down to color 2. And there we go. Perfect. So the mask is only showing us the noise texture on the tile areas, and the grout is a neutral gray value. So this height map is good to go for now. So now let's add in a bump node to plug it all in. First, let's zoom out a bit, and let's plug the principled node back into the output by holding Ctrl, Shift, and left clicking on it. And let's get a good view of some of the tiles so we can make sure that this bump map is actually working. And now let's press Shift and A, and from the vector menu, add in a bump node. And we'll add it in right there. And now let's plug our height map from here into the bump node by clicking on the color output and dragging it to the height input. And now the bump node will convert this height map into a normal map, which we can now plug into the normal input of the principled node. So let's click on this normal output and connect it to the normal input. And there we go. So we obviously have some work to do, but the bump node is working. Now obviously the bumping is way too extreme at the moment, and in order to limit the distance that something can bump inward or outward, we can adjust the distance value right here. It's similar to the scale value for the displacement node here, and how this limits the distance of displacement. Now, to make sure our displacement map's scale value increased or decreased with the texture scale, we plugged in this divide node right here, which is dividing our displacement value by the texture scale value. And that keeps the displacement consistent no matter what the texture scale is. So let's try using this node for the bump node's distance as well to keep that consistent with the scaling too. In short, using this for the bump node as well is going to make sure that if we change the texture scale, that the bumping increases or decreases with that scale, just like we did with the displacement node. So let's connect this value output of the divide node to the distance input of the bump node. Alright, cool, so that's looking better. And now this amount of bump will stay proportional if we change the main texture scale. It still may be a little bit too extreme though, so we'll need to lessen the contrast of the height map running into the bump node. And to do that, we'll run the noise texture through a math node. We could actually just lower the strength value of the bump node here, which would be perfectly fine if this was the only detail running into it. But we'll actually be mixing in other height details for the bump map too, like some noise for the grout material and maybe some bumpiness for mud that we'll add later on. So I think it would be smarter to just leave the bump node alone, because if we set this too low, then this affects the maximum amount of bump that other details can achieve. So it's better to just leave this at full strength, and then lower the contrast of each detail running into it as needed. That's going to give us a lot more freedom. So to lessen the effect of the noise texture, let's add in a math node set to multiply. And here's the line coming down from the noise texture and plugging into the mix node. So let's press Shift and A, and from the converter menu, add in a math node, and drop it over that line so it connects. And then I'll press G and just move it over the others. And now let's set the operation type to multiply, and we'll set the multiply amount to something really low, like 0.05. And that looks good to me, just a little bit of waviness on those surfaces. And now let's double check changing the main texture scale to make sure that the amount of waviness on the surfaces remain consistent no matter what the scale of the texture is. So let me go all the way back to our value nodes, and I'll change the texture scale here to 1, so we have one single tile, and that looks like the same amount of waviness on the surface. So I think that all worked out. Let me change this back to 10. And I think that about does it. Let me go back over to our nodes here. Alright, now we want a little bit of bump detail from the crackle as well. Right now you can see it's not contributing to the bump map. So let's mix this crackle detail in with the noise texture before it reaches all these nodes here. So let's pan back up to our tile material nodes up here and zoom into the noise texture node. Now I want to mix in just the thin black cracks in this. And we have that node right up here. Let me preview this greater than node just to make sure. Yep, that's it. So we'll mix this in with the noise texture node down here. And we'll do that with the mix RGB node set to multiply, and we'll multiply these cracks on top of the noise texture. So let's go down here and I'll press Shift and A, and from the color menu, add in a mix RGB node and drop it over that line there so it connects. And now let's switch this mix type to multiply. And we'll leave the noise texture connected to color 1, and we'll connect the cracks to color 2 so they get multiplied on top. So let's go up here to the greater than node. I'll click on the value output and drag it to the color 2 input here. And let's preview this by holding Control, Shift, and left clicking on it. And let's set the multiply factor to 1 for the full effect. Alright, there we go. So the cracks are getting multiplied on top of the clouds. Let's see what this looks like in the finished result. So let's go back over to the principled node, hold Control, Shift, and left click on that to plug it back in. Now the crackle bump is obviously a little bit too strong. I want this to be more subtle. So we'll run the crackle through a map range node to brighten the dark values so it gets multiplied on top of the noise texture less. So let's head back up to the top nodes over here. And here we have the greater than node, which is the thin cracks. And that gets plugged into the multiply node where it mixes with the noise texture. So we need to change this before it reaches this multiply node. So let's add in a map range node along this connection line here. So I'll press Shift and A, and from the converter menu, add in a map range node and drop it on that line so it connects. And then I'll press G and move it over there to organize things a bit. And now let's hold Control, Shift, and left click on this to preview it. And I'll zoom in so we can see these. Now our goal is to brighten the dark values so that there's less to multiply on top of the noise texture. And with the map range node, to increase the brightness of dark values, you simply increase the to minimum value here. So let's increase this really high so these are really faded. I'll increase this to 0.975. And you can't really see them now, but the bump map will pick up on them. They're just really faded in this view. So let's go back down to our principled node now, and let's see if this worked by holding Control, Shift, and left clicking on this to plug it back in. And there we go. So that crack is a lot more subtle now, and I think we're good to go with that. Alright, so now we want our crackle bump map to be controlled by the crackle amount node over here. Because when I turn this down to 0, for example, it gets rid of the crackle texture, but I also want it to get rid of the crackle bump map as well. So let's see what we can do about that. Let me zoom out and go back up to our nodes over here. And here's the multiply node that's multiplying the cracks on top of the noise texture. And we have a mix factor value here. And when this is set to 1, you can see we have the crack bump map. And when it's set to 0, we don't have the bump map. So we should be able to just plug that crack amount value node right into this mix factor here, and that should take care of everything for us. So let me go back to the crack amount node right here, and somewhere along the connection line coming from it, we can probably just add a reroute node and connect that to the multiply node. So let me zoom out. So this is going up and then over to right here. We actually have a reroute node there already. So let me zoom in, and I'll left click on that and drag it to the mix factor input there. And let's see if that worked. Let me go back to the crack amount node now, and let me set this to 1. And we have the crackle texture as well as the crackle bump map. And when I set that to 0, we have neither of them, so that's working perfectly. And then we can have anything in between if we wanted to, if we just wanted a little bit of crackle effect. But let me leave that set to 1 for now. Alright, now let me zoom out. And the last part of this will be to just set up a control for tile reflection roughness. Earlier in the project, we set up a roughness map that we plugged into the roughness input of the principled node. And that roughness map, if we follow this up, is coming from this invert node right here. Now, the black values on this map give us 0 roughness, so the tiles have perfect reflections. I want the option to have more blurry reflections, so we basically just need to brighten up the black values to do that. And for that, we'll use a math node. And we'll add the math node in along this connection line before it reaches the roughness input. So let's press Shift and A, and from the converter menu, add a math node and drop it on this line so it connects. And then I'll press G and move that up next to it to organize. And now let's hold Control, Shift, and left click on this to preview it. And we'll leave this set to add so that it adds brightness, and you can see it working already. So let's go back over to our principled node and hold Control, Shift, and left click on that to preview it. And there we go. Cool. So now we have more blurry reflections. Now let's go back up to the add node real quick. Now, one issue with the add node is that you can end up with values above 1 or even below 0 depending on what number you're adding in. If I change this to 100, for example, the resulting amount of roughness is outside the realistic 0 to 1 range. So the surface looks a bit strange. So what we'll need to do is enable this option here called Clamp. That option will clamp the result to the 0 to 1 range, which is the range we want for the roughness values. So basically, it makes sure that no matter how high the result is, it will clamp it back down to 1. Now let me set this back to 0 for now. And now we just need a value input node to easily customize this. So let me head over to our value nodes over here. I'll just select this top one and press Shift and D to duplicate it, and I'll move it straight up to there. And then I'll press F2 to rename this to Tile Roughness. And now with this still selected, let's go back over to the add node over here, and I'll hold Shift and then click on this to select it, and then press the F key to create a connection between them. Alright, and let me go back and see if that worked out. So let me set this to 0, and it works. So I'll set it to 1 for full roughness, or 0.5 for somewhere in the middle, and cool. So that's good to go. So let me set that to 0 for now. And that's actually going to do it for the tile material, but I do want to clean things up a bit. So let me press Control and Spacebar over here to full screen this. And we'll definitely need a reroute along that line to prevent all this intersection here. So let me hold Shift, and I'll right click and drag through there to add a reroute. Then I'll press G, and I'll bring that up and over there so it lifts that line above all those nodes. And that looks pretty good to me. And what else? Everything else looks pretty good. We do have a little intersection there. So if you want to, you can add a reroute through there. And I'll press G and move that down like that. Alright, so one last thing. I just want to add a frame around these new tile material nodes. Oh, also I have one last intersection here. So let me add a reroute through that, and then I'll move that up and over. And now let's add a frame around all these. So I'll left click and drag over all of them to select them. And then I'll press Shift and P to add a frame. And then let's press the N key for the right side toolbar. And let's turn off color. And for the label here, we'll name this Tile Material. And there's our label at the top, so that's good to go. And that about does it. So I'll press N to get rid of the toolbar, and press Control and Spacebar to get out of full screen. And that'll do it. So that does it for this lecture, and I'll see you in the next one.